So it's not quite Epiphany yet. Epiphany doesn't actually start until January 6th. So we are still in the midst of the 12 days of Christmas. We're close enough. So I thought this morning I would share the story of the wise men. Now, the story of the wise men only shows up in the Gospels, and it shows up in the Gospel of Matthew. So I am going to read that account to you this morning from Matthew. It's in chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. And it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod had heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it had stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks. I had an interesting time with look a little bit deeper into this, and I'd wondered, part of what I'm going to try to do here is not so much give you a message. If you ever had the chance to read Scripture, it's a really interesting passage. It's a really interesting piece of the story, and as we said, it actually only is reflected in one of the Gospels that actually tell the story of Christmas. So in some ways, it was actually wondered whether or not Matthew had actually made this up in some ways, because it isn't reflected anywhere else. But going forward, I had a lot of particular passage, and I thought it might be fun for us to talk about a couple of things. One, do you know who the Magi were? And by the way, as I know, I'm not watching you live, but I'll talk to you guys later on. I'll come back. But talk amongst each other a little bit here. Who were the Magi? Who were they really? Were they kings? Were they scholars? Were they magicians? Who were they? Why did they come? Why did these people come from the east bringing extremely expensive gifts for a baby boy? What was special about these guys? When did they actually show up? That's always a fun one just to talk about. And why did they bother meeting with Herod in the first place? If we all this was going to happen, of course, we didn't know this was going to happen, but allow them with Herod in the first place. And finally, what can we actually learn from them? What can we take away from the trip of the Magi? So let's talk about the first question. Who were they? The Magi were not kings. So despite what we were not kings, they were scholars, actually astrologers, more than likely. Astrologers and astronomers, they read the sky looking for any kind of clue to associate different celestial signs with other prophecies. And know here too is that Jewish. They were Gentiles. In some ways, some folks believe they may have been God-fearing Gentiles, meaning that they believed the rites of the Jewish religion. Others say they did not necessarily believe in a God at all, but believed in an equal balance in the world of good and evil. No one's really sure. Again, what I'm telling you, I should probably caveat, nobody knows for certain. This is just what scholars and theologians have deduced over time from this story. But we do know that they were not Jewish. So they did not necessarily believe in the faith. They did not necessarily believe in God. So that kind of lays the foundation. And bother coming if this was something they believed in. The next question that sort of follows from that then is, how would they have even known to have come? They really were scholars. At the end of the day, that's really where they came down to. Study the world, study the stars, and see how that worked. And they wanted to study other cultures. And one of the things that I had read about them was that whenever they had their people would take over another set of people, so whether that was going to be taking over the lands, just wanted to take over the lands, they would actually take them over. And then when they did, they would take prisoners, and they would take the prisoners who were actually scholars, and they would bring them into their tribes and would learn from them. And what's really interesting about this is that they believe that with this particular tribe of people, that Daniel, yes, Daniel from the Old Testament, was one of those individuals who had at some point been captured when Babylon had been taken over and been left to teach them about the Old Testament, been left to teach about the Torah and the old ways. So we believe that they would have learned about all of the Old Testament from starting with Daniel, and then that would have gone on in there. So it's just a really interesting intricacies here where we see that. And just so that we can kind of clear the air, one other thing is there probably was not 3 wise men who came. It was probably a caravan. Some people have said maybe 12, some maybe more. But despite the fact that we sing about 3 kings, we boil it down because of the 3 gifts. But in reality, that would have been much, much bigger than that. So the next question comes down to, when did they actually arrive? So there's a lot of discussion about this. So like we have this beautiful nativity set that's set up here, and we have our king Magi that are kneeling king. That's not what happened. Pretty much is an agreement that that's not what happened. When did they arrive is entirely up for debate, and I'm not sure if people have thought about this before, because we know a couple of things. One, that when Matthew was discussing the birth of Jesus, he talks about him being born in a stable. But in the scriptures, when he talks about the Magi, he says that he saw them in a house. So that's the first sort of clue that we know that the wording had changed for Matthew. So we know that he is no longer in the stable, but he's in some kind of a house. That might be where we know he's not anymore. So he may not be an infant, or at least is not a newborn. That, and we sort of look at that time frame, the next piece of the scripture that we see in there talks about Herod meeting secretly to find out the time of when that star had actually appeared. And based on that decision, we can't see what's going on. Apologize, folks. I guess my mic is breaking up. I'm going to see if I can grab a handheld microphone. What was I learning? So after Herod had met with the Magi, they had told him that whatever they told them, which we don't know, about the timing of the star, Herod then makes the decision to go after any baby boy born from 2 years and under. So the assumption we can make is that all of these things happen probably sometime, maybe some scholars say maybe a month after Jesus was born, till sometime when he might have been around 1 or 2. So a lot of things we look at here when we cover this did not happen at the same time. What I also find really interesting about finding the Holy Family is that nothing actually says the star led them. They said they saw the star, and kind of like our Christmas star this year, like literally if you didn't see that Christmas star in like the 2 seconds that it came together, like a minute later they had passed by each other and it was over. This could have been very similar. So they would have seen the star, they would have seen it in the east, and that would have been it, and they weren't following a star. They saw the star, they knew it meant something, and they were going to try to figure out what it meant. And then once they had spoken to Herod, it says the star reappears and brought them to the Holy Family. So it's just really interesting, some of the things I know I believed about this story over time, which may not actually be true. So the next thing I want to talk about is why. Why did they come? So we don't know. We honestly have no idea why they would have come. We don't know what the motivation was behind that, but clearly they had something. Something moved them about this process. And why? But my question was, why connect such a beautiful thing, such a beautiful star in the sky, to the coming of Christ, to the coming of the King of the Jews? And it really comes down to knowing your Old Testament. And I'm not sure I would have ever made this connection, but maybe if I was a scholar of the Old Testament, this would have happened. But there are at least 2 scriptures that we believe they would have had access to that would have led them to this conclusion. One of the first, of course, is the one that we know, which is the prophet in Isaiah. And I'm just going to read this to you really, really quick so you can remember it. So Isaiah 7:14 reads, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel." So that's part of it. And so that's probably what they asked every mother, by the way. Think about that. They probably asked every mother that as they were walking through town. Hey, were you a virgin birth? Probably not the best way to introduce yourself, but probably was how they confirmed the right house, if you think about that one. And then the other Old Testament scripture they would have had to help them on their way is from Numbers. Numbers 24:7. So if I look, 24:17. So in 24:17, it says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel." So if you think about that, a scepter being a king, and the star over Israel. So when they saw that star that appeared out to the east for them, or the west for them, because they were coming from the east, so we were probably in the west, they attached that meaning to that star, to that piece of scripture, and said, okay, this must be the star that's supposed to rise over Israel to give us a sign that a king has been born. So they would have just packed up whatever they were packing up, and they would have headed out to Israel. Now, from here on out, about why they would have met with Herod, let's talk about that for a minute. So some background here, too. Where the Magi come from, they were more than likely Persian. And the Persians and the folks in Jerusalem and Israel did not get along. These were very politically charged rivals. So the Magi just showing up in the capital of Israel was kind of a bad thing to do. It would have been very noticeable. It would have been something people really got charged up about in the first place, because really they didn't want them there. They would have wondered why they showed up, what was happening, why were they going. They would have assumed this was not a peaceful thing that they were doing. So they would have shown up, and now they're walking around asking, where's the King of the Jews? Okay, well, nobody told us that there's a new King of the Jews. We've got a guy on the throne that says he's the King of the Jews. What are you talking about? Because now you have to remember, these guys are the only ones that knew that. They're the only ones that attached the sign of this star to the birth of a king. And now they're walking around going, asking about this, assuming probably that everybody must have known this. Your scholars must have known this. Why didn't your scholars figure this out? So they're just walking around town asking. Now, the most logical thing, why Jerusalem? It's the capital. Where else would you find a king in that time? You would find him in the center. in that palace. So more than likely they were heading to the palace, assuming that if a king had been born, he had been born in a palace. But as they were making their way through town, as we read the scriptures, we see that they didn't actually go to Herod at all. Herod actually heard about them because, of course, they were making enough noise for people in the gossip rooms to get to Herod. But Herod first went to all the scholars in town. So wait a minute. They're asking me about a king. You didn't tell me anything about a king. What is up with this? Where would this king have been born? Why are they here? And that's when they come back with that scripture from the prophet in Micah that says he would have been born in Bethlehem. But they didn't know when it had happened. They had no idea about this star. They didn't know anything had been any kind of sign. They didn't see it. So they only had one piece of the puzzle. Herod needed two pieces. He needed a time frame. So that's why he secretly meets with the Magi. Because remember, him meeting with the Magi would have been political disaster. Nobody wanted them there. Nobody liked them. So he meets with them in secret to ask them when they saw that star so that they could then give him the second piece of the puzzle. And they would then tell them when they actually saw that star first appear. So now he has both pieces of that puzzle. And up until then, I don't know that they ever had any intention of talking to Herod about anything once they found out nobody else knew about a king. They probably had no intention, but they were called. They were called in to meet with him. And maybe at that point they had hoped that they would hear something. And it's not until he has both pieces of that he then gets the idea of what he's going to do to try to destroy the king, to destroy Jesus. And it's something to think about as we go through there. Actually, he probably still didn't even have that long-term plan because he had asked them to come back. Come back. I want to worship him. I want to worship him too. You come back and tell me. And they probably didn't know how insincere Herod was at the time. But they will come back here. And that's when God steps in and says, we're not playing this game. You guys go home, go a different way. We'll deal with him later. And so God puts into motion his plan to protect Jesus. But I found it really interesting how all of these pieces kind of come into play and how it takes all of this lineup of everything behind that in this very simple story that we have. And I just want to talk real quick about what we can do about that. So what can we learn from these Magi? What about their story is so incredible that we can learn something from what they have done? I mean, the first things first, if we haven't pulled it out, and if you have any lessons or something else you've thought about while we're doing this, drop it in the comments. I'd love to see what else you guys are thinking about. But one of the first things that struck me was that the Magi were not Jewish. They may not have even believed in God, yet something about all of this was so moving to them. Whether they got another message we don't know about from God or something else had happened, something moved this group of people to travel to a very politically charged country just to try to have an audience with an infant child. Not even somebody they could have a conversation with. Just to see this little baby. Talk about faith. And faith in something they didn't even know about. Just something they knew was so important that they had to do it. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever been given those messages from God that says, this is so important that you have to go do this? You have to go give this message. You have to go see this person. You have to do this. No matter how hard, how challenging, how scary, you have to do that. So I think that's the first lesson, along with the fact that God will use anybody and everything that he can, believers or not, to put his plans in motion if it's what needs to happen. The next thing is that I saw in there is that we need to always bring our best. So when it comes to the Magi, the gifts that they brought, they weren't just significant in the fact that they had that long-term meaning that we always look at about the birth, the sacrifice, the kings, his death. It's not just that. Those three items, they're imported. They would have been imported typically if you were living in Israel and you wanted gold, frankincense, or myrrh. You would have had to import them from the east. And the items that they brought were extraordinarily expensive. These were not baby gifts. These were definitely not gifts for an infant. They were gifts for a king. But it was the best of what their country, since it was native to them, those three items were the best of what their country had to offer, the very best of what they had to give. They gave their time, their energy, everything to be there with him. And I think we need to think about that too. We need to think about how do we show up? How do we give the best of everything that we have Regardless of the circumstance, how do we always give the best of everything that we have for Jesus and for God? And then the last thing I pulled from this is that we need to remember that there's always more to the story, right? There's always more to a story than what we see on the face. But we also have to remember that those stories are going to lead us down different paths. And we have to remember that when God steps in and intervenes, we need to listen, regardless of how he steps in, whether it's from another person, whether it's from a circumstance, whether it's a dream. When God speaks to us, we need to recognize it, hear it, and heed it. And just like the Magi, sometimes it means we have to take a different path. They had to take a different path home. They had to go another way. They had to figure that out. They had to be so much crazy faith in this journey, because you got to remember one other thing too. When they were going home, even though they took a different path, Herod knew their names, where they were headed. He knew their faces. Like if he wanted to track them down, I'm sure he could have. Not just going another path. They knew where to go if he really wanted to. But it didn't happen because God stepped in. And we have to remember that if we need to take a different path, if our lives and the decisions that we make need us to take a different path, we take it and we go a different direction and take another journey based on what God has told us to do, then we need to have the faith and we need to step out and we need to do it courageously. Regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the fear, regardless of the circumstance, they basically blew off a king and said, "Hi, yeah, you ordered me to do something, but I'm going to go this way and follow somebody else. And I'm going to follow my own path." And sometimes we need to do that too. And that's not an easy thing to do. And the last thing I just want to leave you with here today is just one fun little final thought. And I can't wait to see if you guys have been commenting. I can't wait to see what other things you guys would have thought of. But I just thought I would close with a little bit of a sort of a joke that I love about the three kings, which is this: that had the three wise men or the three magi actually been women rather than men, you know what would have happened, don't you? They would have shown up on time. They would have asked for directions. They would have been there to help deliver the baby. They would have cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and brought some practical gifts for Mary. So with that, I hope you guys can find more joy and more lessons from the Magi. And thanks for